record this presentation. And so if you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your camera. But we'll then be making this whole presentation available after the event for folks who aren't able to make it tonight. So welcome. This is the Lower Nehalem Watershed Council's regular speaker series. We do these monthly between October and May every year. And some of the times we do a board meeting too, like next month will be a board meeting as well, but today it's just the presentation. So we are the Lower Nehalem Watershed Council, and our mission is to protect, preserve, and enhance the Nehalem watershed through leadership, cooperation, and education. We do this in this green area right here, and you'll see that, oops, well, back up. Oh boy, somehow we are advancing way faster than I want to be. Okay, there we are. This green area right here is our service area for the Lower Nehalem Watershed Council. It goes all the way up to Humbug Creek, which is just downstream from Humbug Creek right here, just downstream of Highway 26. And it also incorporates all the North Fork Nehalem and all the Salmonberry River. So it's a pretty sizable area. We work with landowners, private companies, local, state, federal agencies, and any other stakeholder to restore and enhance habitat for fish and wildlife. We do this through research, fish passage projects, riparian plantings, in-stream enhancement, and wetland restoration, and those are all things that I'll expound a little bit more on in a minute. And we also do outreach. In the past, we've gone to farmers markets. We have either an annual barbecue or a dinner for supporters most years. We help to host the Nehalem Estuary Cleanup, and we do the speaker series, and then summer hikes under the name Explore Nature. So tonight, I'm just going to feature some of our new grant awards because they kind of cover a pretty broad range of the kind of work that we do. So we just got awarded 3 new grants on March 9th. I'm pretty excited to share what we're going to be doing with them. So the first of these is the Grand Rapids Creek Large Woody Debris and Beaver Dam Analog Enhancement. And this project is going to install 5 log jams and 2 beaver dam analogs in habitat along Grand Rapids Creek. And this is going to create, improve the habitat complexity by putting those logs and those beaver dam analogs in place across the creek. That will help to back water up a little bit, which will slow it down, allowing gravel to sort behind the logs as the water flows over it, which creates good spawning habitat. It also helps to carve out pools for fish to hold in during the summer. And it creates what we call floodplain connectivity. By slowing the water down in the channel, it pools up, and so the water spreads out during those high flows over the floodplain, allowing it to infiltrate into the ground instead of all rushing out down the creek. And so you get better groundwater recharge when you have large wood and beaver in your water system. And that's good for summer habitat for fish because you have better, more cold water coming in the system in the summer. It's good for our own access to water. And it also helps to slow water down and kind of spread out flood events. So instead of when the rains come in the winter, the river going all the way up really high and then coming really far, then coming way down again, all of it very rapidly, that flooding gets kind of spread out over time. And that creates a little bit less scour. That helps to reduce the erosion that's going on people's stream banks. And again, it helps to do that groundwater recharge I was talking about. So this is a pretty exciting opportunity we have, and it's going to be a partnership with Greenwood Resources, and it looks like the bottom of that slide got chopped off. Another project that we're working on right now, or going to be working on, that was awarded, is this phase 1 of the Coal Creek riparian restoration. And so we're working with a couple of private landowners to plant 2,700 feet along Coal Creek, which is about a half mile. And we're going to be replacing a culvert that is a partial fish barrier on a tributary to Coal Creek. Riparian plantings are good for stream shading. They're improved nutrient cycling. They become the large wood that recruits into the stream in the future. And we're going to create fish passage that's going to help fish access 500 feet of habitat up to a county road barrier that wasn't available before on a residential property. And we've actually already started working on this, even though we only received the grant 9 days ago. It was awarded because the culvert washed out for one of those landowners for the landowner that we're doing the culvert replacement for back in one of the flood storms that happened in February. So we've already started the process to get everything permitted to put a replacement structure in here that will provide for better passage. And also because it'll have a wider crossing, the chances that it'll get plugged up or that the water coming downstream will just be too much for it are a lot less. And so these people are going to have a lot less chance of a similar event like this happening again in the future. So the third thing that we got awarded is this Nehalen River Ranch Riparian Re-Vegetation project. It's a much larger revegetation project that includes 7,000 feet along the river. So that's over a mile of river frontage that we're going to be planting, and 4 acres of silvopasture at the Nehalen River Ranch. And silvopasture is a technique where you plant trees in your field to provide shade for your cows to rest under during the summer. They also provide additional types of forage. They provide bird habitat, and they promote different kinds of grasses. So you promote cool seasonal grasses. We're also going to be doing some pretty great experimental knotweed management in this project. And we're going to be using flash grazing both with cows and goats at Nehalen River Ranch to try and keep the knotweed down while we get plants established through the knotweed and up above that to hopefully reduce some of the density in the future through shading and some of that competitive effect. So once we get the plants above the knotweed, we're hoping that that will be enough that they will be able to suppress the knotweed, especially in combination with continued grazing by both the cattle and the goats. And that's in partnership with Tillamook Estuaries Partnership and Nehalen River Ranch, which folks down here in the Nehalen probably know pretty well. And we have upcoming, oops, come on, there we are. We have some upcoming events. So this is the March 18th speaker series, but on March 8th, we're gonna have a talk about planning for sea level rise on the Oregon coast. And then on May 13th, we're going to be talking about wildfires in the Coast Range with Dan Donato, who has done quite a bit of work with fires in the past in the region. So that's it for that portion. Tonight's speaker is Jeremy Lees. He is the owner and operator of Bio-Surveys LLC. He's been working with Bio-Surveys for 13 years. And in that time, he's co-authored numerous biosurvey reports and inventoried fish on thousands of miles of Oregon rivers and streams. And so without further ado, please welcome Jeremy Lees. Take it away.
Hello. Nice to see you all. Good to be here.
I forgot one thing, which was just a request to everyone hold questions until the end of the talk, we'll have a question period. You can stack them in chat so you don't forget, or you can just keep them in mind and raise your hand when we get to that part. Sorry, now I'll let you start.
No, that'd be great. Yeah, thank you. Let's get started. Okay. Let's go on here. Where is that? Give me a minute here.
Maybe it's from beginning and then you do it.
Oh yeah. There we go. There we go. Get myself situated here. Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming. Zach gave my introduction. My name is Jeremy Lees. I'm with Bio-Surveys. Bio-Surveys is a small consulting firm that specializes in biological inventories with a focus on salmonids. We had the pleasure of conducting inventories on the Lower Nehalem in 2018 and 2019, and in the Upper Nehalem starting back in 2008. This is intended to be a high-level review of our findings. Our report provides a far more in-depth review of the data, and if anybody's looking for some more information or more site-specific information, I encourage you to take a look if you want to go deeper. As Zach said, we're going to hold questions until the end of the presentation. Now, the 2018 and 2019 rapid bioassessment inventory of the Lower Nehalem and North Fork Nehalem covered 204.3 miles of river and stream habitat. And that was a total of 153 tributaries. This effort encompassed all mainstem and tributary habitats exhibiting anadromous potential from the Pacific Ocean to the confluence of Humbug Creek. Spawning gravel abundance estimates and anchor site identifications were conducted on 169.6 miles of stream habitats. Only spawning gravel sites appropriate for coho were quantified. The intent of the spawning gravel inventory was to answer the question of whether availability of spawning gravel is functioning as a limiting factor for coho production. The limiting factors analysis was included to identify key zones of high production potential. The thermal refugia inventory was conducted on 34.7 miles of the lower main stem. This is starting at the Pacific Ocean and extending upstream to the confluence of Humbug Creek. The intent of this inventory was to identify cold water contributions, providing thermal refugia to salmonids during periods of elevated temperatures in the Lower Nehalem main stem. Now we're going to break down these four parts throughout the inventory and go a little bit deeper into all of them. Our project objective was to quantify distribution and relative abundance of all salmonid species within the range of anadromy during summertime, pinch period, low flow regimes. Sampling during this peak temperature period where thermal migrations concentrate fish in critical habitats allows us to observe the temperature limitations of the system and potential thermal refugia where fish may be congregating. Other intent is to establish baseline distribution and abundance metrics, provide a foundation for long-term trend analysis, identify anchor habitats, and guide future restoration and management actions. The results of this project are our final report, which is 363 pages, which contain all this information and is intended to be used as a guide for restoration. The methods of our inventory. Snorkel surveys were conducted in summer months, and as I noted, increased temperatures and decreased flows concentrate fish and highlight temperature-dependent migrations, temperature limitations, and availability of thermal refugia. Landowner contacts were made for all small, private, industrial, and public ownerships. Snorkelers visually searched 100% of each selected pool, counting all salmonids observed. In pools with high abundance, this was often done in several passes to ensure that all fish were quantified. The survey continued sampling at a 20% frequency every 5th pool until the end of anadromous potential was reached. The survey did not describe the upper limits of native cutthroat distribution, which extend much higher into the watershed. And for the last one, these supplemental pools may have been beaver ponds, unusually complex pools, thermal refugia, or tributary junctions. We included these pools to ensure that the best habitat was not excluded with the random 20% sample. Of course, these numbers were not included in the expansion of the count, but these sites provided great insight into the habitat function. Now let's take a look at the species of interest. Here is a coho. The Oregon coast coho are currently listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Nehalem coho are considered an independent population of the Oregon coastal coho, ESU, evolutionary significant unit. Though out of the 28 salmonids listed under the ESA on the West Coast, coho salmon are considered to be one of the closest to recovery. I think it may be too early to tell. Juvenile Chinook, most of which leave their natal stream shortly after emergence from the gravel to rear in the lower mainstem or estuarine habitats. For that reason, we do not consider our Chinook counts to be anywhere near a population estimate, but are valuable for year-to-year trend analysis. Juvenile steelhead, which we count as 1 year old or older. Young of the year fish are too difficult to distinguish from cutthroat with snorkel surveys. And cutthroat trout. Here is a beautiful big cutthroat trout with a full belly, hopefully not full of coho. The Nehalen watershed encompasses 855 square miles and includes areas of Washington, Columbia, Clatsop, and Tillamook counties. The upper and lower Nehalem are delineated by the black line on the map. The basin was historically dominated by old growth coniferous ecosystems with expansive marshlands in the lower gradient areas and estuaries. The Nehalem is home to Chinook salmon, coho salmon, chum salmon, winter steelhead, resident and sea-run cutthroat trout, small populations of rainbow trout. Interestingly, we also observed adult sockeye during our inventories, though they are not thought to spawn in the system. Native people lived in the Nehalem watershed for thousands of years before colonization of Europeans. They subsisted primarily on salmon and other seafood, managing the fishery and landscape to maintain the health and productivity of the aquatic and terrestrial habitats. During the late 1700s, disease carried by Europeans preceded their settlement of the area and wiped out an estimated 70 to 90% of the native Nehalem population. European colonization of the Nehalen Valley began in the mid-1800s with logging and fishing as the primary sources of income. Heavy fish harvests and logging of old growth continued through the 1900s, and after less than a century of European settlement, the last old growth in the watershed was cut in 1945, and sharp declines in adult salmonid returns were recorded by the 1950s. Nehalem historic and current salmon runs. Estimated runs in the late 1800s were about 236,000 coho and 44,000 Chinook. This is based on harvest records from the canneries. Salmon runs were likely greater before mass European harvest began. Amazingly, adult returns remained relatively high through the early part of the 1900s, despite the heavy fish harvests, but salmon runs began a sharp decline in the 1950s, and gill netting was ultimately banned in 1956. Hatchery began operation on Foley Creek in 1926, which raised cutthroat and winter steelhead, and was replaced in 1966 by the North Fork Nehalem Hatchery. The North Fork Nehalem Hatchery is still in operation and currently raises coho, Chinook, and winter steelhead, with coho and steelhead released into the North Fork, which I believe are the only hatchery fish released into the Nehalen Basin. Though hatchery supplementation continued through the latter part of the century and was accompanied by a significant peak in the late 70s, coho returns plummeted in the 90s from poor ocean conditions caused by El Nino years. This was a brutal period for coho throughout the entire coastal-wide evolutionary significant unit. Coho runs have rebounded in the 2000s, but remain low to the present, with unsustained peaks over the past 2 decades. The graph of estimated returns from the early 90s through 2019. As I noted, historic runs of coho were up near 236,000, tremendous compared to current numbers. This is an ODF&W recovery tracker chart. Note the collapse of the population throughout the 90s with some marginal gains over the last 20 years, yet remaining well below ODF&W's broad sense goal. ODF&W defined their broad sense goal as recovering the population of naturally produced salmon and steelhead until they are sufficiently abundant, productive, and diverse. Corresponding adult escapement for our inventoried years was 8% in 2017 and 6% in 2018 of ODF&W's broad sense goal. Human impacts on aquatic habitat. There are many impacts on aquatic habitat from a long history of human development. Here's a list. I'm not going to go into all of them or most of them, but their legacy will be evident in many of the slides. I've highlighted a few here that we'll take a closer look at. Here's an example. This is the North Fork Nehalem. There's a surveyor there in the distance, confluence of Cougar Creek, I believe. Here's an example of the impacts of log drives and splash damming on the North Fork Nehalem. Log drives down the Nehalen started in 1901 and lasted until 1926, feeding sawmills in Wheeler, Pittsburgh, and Vernonia. During these drives, logs were drug into the river and floated downstream on high winter flows. During these years, splash dams were installed on the North Fork Nehalem. In a splash dam, the river is dammed so that water and logs back up behind it. Then the dam is released and the cascading water and logs are flushed downstream to the sawmill. Splash dams were not reliant on high winter flows, so they could be used much of the year. Though logging in this way at this time was central to the economy, these practices were devastating to stream habitats and did irreparable damage to the aquatic ecosystems. As the log drives tore downstream, they scoured the river bottom, incising the channel and sweeping embedded wood structures out. This disconnected channels from their floodplains, resulting in further channel entrenchment and simplification. Riparian vegetation along stream banks was also destroyed as logs were drug into the river and floated downstream. These timber harvests also removed most of the mature conifers from the riparian, diminishing the potential for natural recruitment of big wood back into the affected aquatic systems. Additionally, in the time of gill netting, wood was frequently cleared from the mainstem reaches by fishermen to avoid fouling their nets. And later, state agency stream cleaning delivered one of the hardest blows with uninformed practices that cleared woody debris from creeks of all sizes with the notion that it would aid adult fish passage. With almost none of this historic complexity remaining, the loss of these wood resources has resulted in an overall increasing gradient and a decline in the system's ability to store and sort spawning gravels. The system's inability to replace this wood with limited wood delivery potential from either upslope debris flows or riparian canopies currently limits the recovery of ecosystem function. Here's Buchanan Creek, a significant cold water contribution in the most temperature limited reach of the North Fork. A 2.3 Celsius temperature differential was observed at the time of the inventory of Buchanan. Buchanan Creek was at 16.1 Celsius, 61 degrees Fahrenheit, and North Fork mainstem at 18.4, 65.1 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not a huge difference in temperature, but one that bridges a critical threshold for salmonid health. The simplified channel characteristics in this stream reach greatly limited the rearing capacity for temperature-dependent migrants. Elevated coho density documented in this first pool, shown here, suggests that upstream juvenile migration out of the mainstem North Fork was occurring. Here's a shot of a down maple in the mainstem North Fork, just downstream of the Buchanan confluence and still within the cold water plume. High abundances of salmonids, including the highest coho count in the basin, 522 fish, were observed congregating around this fallen maple and undercut bank. These fish were attracted to the cover provided by the fallen tree, along with the thermal refugia provided by Buchanan Creek. Something ephemeral like this and seemingly insignificant was providing a critical missing component to the habitat. Unfortunately, it probably washed out with higher flows later in the year. But for that season, it provided a valuable and hard to find protection from predation and potentially lethal water temperatures. Addressing lack of complexity in larger order streams like the mainstem North Fork can be challenging, considering the high velocity seasonal flows that would tear most structures apart and wash them downstream. But in smaller order streams like Anderson Creek, addressing habitat dysfunction is an easier task. The simplified channel of this tributary exhibited a much higher summer rearing capacity for juvenile coho than was observed in our 2019 inventory. Anderson Creek was found to be spawning gravel limited, resultant from the lack of wood complexity required to sort the available mobile substrates. Additionally, the simplified channel structure provided reduced summer and winter rearing potential with shallow pools and little refuge from predation or high velocity flows. Here's a shot of Buchanan Creek. This is an example of a treated habitat, similar size to Anderson Creek. The large logs were placed to address a lack of channel complexity. Note the debris accumulation and cover the structures provide to the pool below, and the gravel deposition around the structures. As the structures mature, they reduce the velocity of flows while accumulating bed load and debris. As the bed load increases, the channel raises in elevation, increasing floodplain linkage and encouraging lateral migration of the channel while improving groundwater recharge. These habitat characteristics increase both summer and winter rearing potential. The structures provide refuge from predation in the summer, increase scour of the pools, and reduce the velocity of winter flows while expanding off-channel habitat for fish to take refuge during high flow events. Let's take a look at some riparian issues now. Here's an example of agricultural and livestock impacts. We see channel entrenchment and high solar exposure with blackberry riparian and a cattle trampled active channel. This is a relatively common sight down in the agricultural and pasture lands of the lower North Fork. These reaches within tidal influence are particularly important to nomadic coho, which flush out of their natal creeks shortly after emergence from the gravel and rear in lower mainstem and estuarine habitats through spring, and seek refuge from rising salinity and increased mainstem temperatures during summer months. Lower reaches of Cole, Anderson, Little Ratkeep, AC, and gravel exhibited similar habitat characteristics. And lastly, for the barriers, let's take a look at some barriers to passage. This is a condensed version of a table in the report. A total of 17 barriers to passage were identified, most failing or undersized culverts, and these were the top priorities. We're going to take a closer look at the fish hatchery dam. The North Fork Hatchery Dam was found to be a barrier to upstream temperature-dependent migrations in a temperature-limited reach with huge congregations of salmonids trapped below the dam. You can see the dam consists of about a 1 foot concrete sill that in the summertime they put an additional 1 foot board in to increase the water level of the pool above for the intake to the hatchery. Temperatures at the time of our inventory were 18.5, 65.3 degrees Fahrenheit, 18.5 Celsius. This pool had high solar exposure with low wood complexity. Buchanan Creek, a valuable cold water contribution, as we saw earlier, was just upstream and out of reach to these fish. Highest pool counts in the entire RBA inventory for steelhead juveniles, 85 fish, and cutthroat, 140 fish. And the second highest pool counts for coho, second to the Buchanan Creek pool, 384 fish, and 0 trout, 250 fish. The cutthroat observed here were primarily adult fluvial or sea run fish, some of extraordinary size. Additionally, 4 fin-clipped rainbows, likely residualized precocial males, 2 adult chinook, and 1 fin-clipped adult summer steelhead were also observed. Here's some video footage of the hatchery pool. Some of those large cutthroat, a little bit lower down in the pool. And as you move up a little closer to the dam, there's one of those fin-clipped rainbows there with some lesions on the side. As you move farther up in the pool, we see the smaller cutthroat, the coho and the steelhead congregating. Another fin-clipped rainbow there. There was a little bit of cover in the top of this pool, some debris with some moss hanging down, and that's where most of these juvenile fish were located. Note the size of some of these coho, some really large coho, likely either holdovers that didn't smolt out last year or nomadic fish that reared lower in the mainstem, where food sources are more abundant. And the temperature's a little warmer and the fish grow faster. This pool was just packed with fish. Excuse my cinematography here. Just want to get a feel for just how many fish there are in this pool. Coho there with lesion on the side. Numerous fish in this pool were noted with lesions or signs of stress. Okay, see some of the size of those coho are almost the size of 1+ steelhead. Now looking back in the pool again, we'll get another shot of some of those cutthroat. Just some real behemoths. Oof. Another couple big ones back there. Fish really have nowhere to go. Packed in this pool. Food resources must be low. Well, they've got all those juvenile fish at the head, I guess. So over the course of the summer, predation is probably pretty heavy. All right, let's take a look at some other passage issues. The Nehalen Falls is a probable juvenile barrier to upstream migration within a severely temperature limited reach of the lower mainstem. This is the adjacent fish ladder, which, as you can see, is not functioning during low flows. I'm not sure if this ladder was ever intended to aid in juvenile migration during summer months, but it would certainly be helpful and would play a critical role for temperature-dependent fish migrations if this flow issue here could be addressed. Here's an example of a perched and rusted out failing culvert. These were the most common barriers to passage observed during inventories and are low-hanging fruit for restoration. This one is in particularly bad shape, completely rusted out, undercut, just a jagged edge of steel there. Let's move on to thermal refugia. Temperature limitations and thermal refugia. These inventories were conducted from July 27th to August 2nd, intended to capture the peak temperature period of the lower mainstem. Severe temperature limitations in the mainstem Nehalen were found during these summer months, with temperatures up to 25.5 degrees Celsius, 77.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures in this range exceed thresholds tolerable to salmonids without severe detrimental effects on growth, health, and ultimately survival. Salmonids rearing in the lower mainstem Nehalen in summer months need access to thermal refugia during these pinch periods to escape the uninhabitable mainstem temperatures. We conducted a 100% sample of cool water contributions detectable by snorkeling from river miles 0 to 34.7, confluence of Humbug Creek. This inventory identified a total of 31 sites, 27 of which were observed providing thermal refugia to significant abundances of salmonids. Excuse me. Additionally, we included a pool head sample, a 50% sample of all the pool heads in between the thermal refugias to try to establish a baseline of mainstem rearing of fish, of salmonids. One of the goals of this inventory was to document the presence of coho rearing in the lower mainstem Nehalem and attempt to quantify their abundance. Coho fawn rearing in these lower mainstem and estuarine habitats represent an important subset of the population. Following emergence from the red in spring, most of the coho fry rear in their natal stream for about a year before migrating to saltwater as smolts. However, large numbers of young of the year fry move downstream following emergence from the gravel. The component of the coho population expressing this alternative or nomadic life history trait represents an unknown but likely underestimated percentage of the total population. This behavior of all salmon, and coho in particular, allows these species to take advantage of more productive habitats downstream of their natal zone, resulting in higher ecological resiliency and increasing the species' ability to cope with environmental uncertainty. In summer months, once the rains subside, temperatures in the lower Nehalen mainstem and estuary start to rise. Salinity levels also begin to increase in the estuary as the dry season progresses. This stimulates juveniles to move upstream in search of refugia. Of the 31 sites that we found, these were the highest producing and therefore the highest priority for restoration. Cutthroat were by far the dominant species observed utilizing the thermal refugia, with coho second and chinook a close third. Interestingly, no coho were observed below Nehalen Falls, just below Fall Creek there. This may have been due to the complete lack of cover and refuge for juvenile fish within that reach and high rates of predation. Most of the highest temperature differentials were observed in some of the smaller tributaries, where larger tributaries like the Salmonberry, though had the highest volume of cold water contribution, had some of the lowest temperature differentials. These refugia were observed in many forms, from large high-flow tributaries like Cook and Salmonberry to tiny little seeps that were collected water in shallow alcoves. Fish utilization was not observed at all cold water contributions. Several lacked configurations that allowed the cold plume to accumulate sufficiently before mixing with the main stem. No coho were observed rearing outside of thermal refugia. This graph here shows all of the thermal refugia, all of the fish rearing in the thermal refugia throughout the inventory. Interesting to note the cutthroat distribution trends diminishing downstream of significant cold water contributions like Fall, Salmonberry, Spruce Run. This is only a snapshot of fish distribution, but conveys the movement of upstream thermal migration and attraction to these cold water sources. Note the dead zone upstream of the Salmonberry. The Salmonberry is the highest volume tributary to Lower Nehalem upstream of the North Fork. And as I said before, one of the most significant cold water contributions. Looks like a couple miles upstream of the Salmonberry, there were no additional thermal refugias coming in or none that had the correct configurations to hold fish. Steelhead and young of the year trout were not included in this graph due to low abundance. Here's a beautiful 12-inch female cutthroat trout, pre-spawning mortality with a belly full of eggs. No sign of injury on this fish, is likely the victim of toxic stream temps. Probably could have eaten it, it was so fresh. Here we are at Cook Creek, popular fishing spot and swimming hole, and one of the most valuable thermal refugia in the Nehalen Basin, attracting hundreds of sea run cutthroat, along with juvenile and adult chinook, adult chum, steelhead, and rainbows, and the occasional adult sockeye. The primary limiting factors observed in most of these sites was lack of complexity in the form of cover. Unable to regulate their own body temperature, these fish are forced to seek refuge at these sites with no place to hide from predation. If they leave, they succumb to the extreme mainstem temps, so they pack together, waiting out the summer temperature spikes. Many sites had high density cohabitation of mixed age classes rearing together in habitats that were lacking adequate refuge to escape from predators. Throughout the summer, this lack of cover likely led to high predation rates from fish rearing alongside, as well as birds and mammals. Here's some video footage of Cook Creek. Now, early in the season, we had the opportunity to survey this site multiple times throughout the season. And early in the season, we saw chinook and juvenile steelhead and juvenile cutthroat rearing relatively high near the surface here. Over the course of the summer, their numbers diminished, and by the end of the summer, they were gone, and only large adult fish remained. This was taken at the end of the summer. Note that clear, cold water coming in out of Cook Creek. You can see the mixing. Now there were lots of fish kind of tucked right underneath the hood of Cook Creek coming in, but also their distribution extended downstream with deeper pool there at the bottom of that. You know, as the water mixed, the visibility got a lot worse as you move farther away from Cook Creek. So it's very hard to quantify the fish down there, but there were just hundreds of fish swirling around down there. Again, very large cutthroat trout. And over the course of the summer, adult chum, adult chinook, and an adult sockeye. Here's an example of a very shallow refugia with high salmonid usage. This is a tiny little trib with very cold water. You can see the flows coming in at the lower right. So the tiny little trickle coming in, and I hope you can see the fish congregating in the center left there. This site did not look like much from the surface, and you could have easily walked right by it. But we counted 60 coho, 75 cutthroat, and 65 chinook rearing at this site. Temperature differential was 11 degrees Celsius, with the mainstem at 24.6 and this little trib coming in at 13.6. Here's Humbug Creek confluence. Many of the steeper tribs had these cobble and gravel depositions at their confluences. This resulted in largely subsurface flows into the mainstem and restricted access to upstream juvenile migration into these systems. Most of the time, these habitats in the lower reaches of these tributaries lack juvenile rearing potential anyway, so not a terrible loss. And potential benefits are subsurface flows being removed from the solar exposure at the confluences here. Here's a shot underneath the Halem refugia. See the coho packed in there, congregating at the cold subsurface flows through the gravel. A couple chinook in there too. Fall Creek confluence. It doesn't look like much from the surface. It's hard to really even tell what you're looking at. You know, the confluence is coming in across the creek there around that bright algae bloom. And you can see the water just kind of braiding across the bedrock. The flows entered and spread across the basalt, entering at multiple spots. So this increased area of refuge gave lots of little nooks and crannies for the smaller fish to hide in, but still very deficient in complex cover. Now there's a small little exposed pool that you can see you can see right at the top there, I'm not sure if you guys can see my cursor with that little pool right there, had an extraordinary density of coho. It was 13.4 fish per square meter, second highest observed in the basin. So coho, we're swimming up into that pool, but unfortunately Fall Creek is quite steep and there's a massive log jam underneath the railroad just upstream and has very little pool habitat in the lower reach, so did not offer a lot to upstream juvenile migration. Here is Fall Creek video footage. You can note the mixing of the water. You can see that cold water coming in. Now this is up tight. The shallow reaches, those nooks and crannies where all the juvenile fish were hiding out. Many growths on fish were noted in here as well. And now turning around, looking back into the deeper water, you can see the larger cutthroat, a couple large Chinook back there too. Strange discolorations, some of the fish as well. I'll give you one more. This is coming from down lower, from kind of behind the cutthroat. Give you an idea of just how many cutthroat were rearing in there. Huge schools of suckers at this site as well. Massive suckers. Cutthroat just packed together. A little bit of cover could go a long way here. Let's move on to spawning gravel abundance. The goal here was to determine if availability of spawning gravel could be functioning as a limiting factor for coho production. Could coho production in the Lower Nehalem Basin be limited by lack of access to high quality spawning gravel? We conducted this inventory throughout 169.6 miles of the combined mainstem and tributary habitats, excluding the Lower Nehalem mainstem. We employed 100% sampling effort with estimations of every potential gravel accumulation, exhibiting the proper gravel size, hydraulic location, and area. Spawning gravel had to be between the size of a marble and a baseball and located in a pool tail-out, glide, or unconsolidated riffle. A minimum of 1 square meter of gravel had to be present to qualify for a potential spawning location. We believe this knowledge is key to understanding system function, and this data set is an essential component in designing a prioritized restoration strategy. Our findings. Here's Foley Creek, where abundant gravel sorting is present throughout much of the system. In fact, in most of the inventoried systems, the estimated adult carrying capacity was well above the estimated adult coho escapement value, which we based on the expanded juvenile abundance documented during our inventories. However, several subbasins did present a deficiency in spawning gravel abundance in relation to juvenile abundance and rearing capacity. These systems were Anderson, Bob's, George, North Fork Cronin, Soapstone, Spruce Run, Trib C and D of the Little North Fork. I believe Trib D is Grand Rapids, also known as Grand Rapids, and West Fork Coal. Several of these creeks were amongst the highest coho producers in the basin, suggesting that in years of higher adult returns, this may be a more widespread issue than we observed. Some of these creeks were also the only systems that neared or exceeded full seeding capacity of the available pool habitats, indicating co-limitations of summer rearing habitat and spawning gravel. North Fork Cronin Creek was one of them. This creek exhibited the highest average rearing density in the basin. Estimated adult escapement into North Fork Cronin was very near the upper threshold of estimated adult carrying capacity. This proximity, along with fully seeded juvenile rearing densities, indicates that spawning gravel and summer rearing habitat pool surface area were functioning as co-limitations for coho production. Here's a shot of a log jam impounding deep bed load with an abundance of sorted gravel extending upstream. Unfortunately, this jam was an ephemeral barrier to adult passage, so coho could not enjoy the bounty. Low wood complexity throughout the habitat downstream that was within the anadromous range was preventing the retention and sorting of the mobile gravels present in the system. Here's a shot lower down where fragments of legacy wood chunks were still providing benefits to the system with the accumulation and sorting of smaller substrates while increasing pool scour and providing some cover. But there's limited potential for significant large conifer recruitment to replace these decaying remnants of the old growth forests that once covered the landscape. Here's looking a bit more downstream where there's further simplification of the channel. All the complexity has been blown to the margins and there are significant reductions in pool scour, bed load retention, and gravel sorting. The channel's been reduced down to boulders and bedrock. For most of the systems that feed the Lower Nehalem, North Fork excluded, higher gradient provides challenges for small wood to hold in the channel. This is largely resultant of the geology of the Lower Nehalem, where the drainages are underlain by Tillamook volcanics. The geology's influence on the basic geomorphology of these streams highlights the role large wood historically played in retaining bed load and sorting gravel. Let's move on to the anchor sites. Limiting factors analysis light, anchor site identification. What is an anchor site? An anchor site is a stream segment that provides all the seasonal habitat requirements for sustaining salmonids from incubation through winter rearing. Identifying these key zones of high production potential helps to understand the biological and morphological characteristics that both create and maintain high ecosystem function. Anchor habitats may be capable of rearing salmonid juveniles at disproportionately higher densities than non-anchor reaches. These are the places to focus conservation efforts. In addition, the inventory contained a numerical rating system based on levels of wood complexity, available spawning gravels, channel sinuosity, and floodplain connectivity. A high functioning anchor had greater wood densities and high quality off-channel linkage. And a low functioning anchor may have the background morphology, but lacking adequate wood and channel complexity. These low functioning anchors would be the high priority candidates for restoration. Here's a map of all our anchor sites plotted in purple, with the North Fork and Lower Nehalem outlined in blue. As you can see, the North Fork had most of the anchor sites, 63%, and the sites were greater in length than those of the Lower Nehalem. Additionally, the area of the North Fork drainage is significantly smaller than that of the Lower Nehalem. This is largely due to the North Fork drainage being underlain primarily by siltstones and sandstones. As a result, the streams are lower in gradient and have more secondary channels. This increases the occurrence of anchor sites and increases the potential for coho production. 97 anchor sites were identified, with only 8 receiving a high function rating. Very few of the anchors exhibited adequate wood complexity. Strom Creek anchor site. This is a beautiful flat down in the Cook floodplain where Strom and Cook ran parallel for about 1,000 feet with high water channels braided across the Elder Flat and deep gravel accumulations throughout. Here's Sally Creek, a confluence of Tribe there, Tribe to Sally Creek there on the right. This anchor extended for about a half mile and up this tributary for about another 800 feet with low terraces and sinuous channel meander throughout. Very low wood complexity was documented. It's predominantly alder riparian. Very few conifers. This is an example of a low functioning anchor. This reach exhibited low terrace heights, wide floodplain, and cool summer water temps, but the simplified channel lacked wood complexity and had very limited floodplain interaction. A Let's take a look at some of the highest fish producers. This is a condensed version of a table that's in the report. I added the linear distances and percentages of contribution to the total mileage to highlight the production level of some of the smaller tributaries. This does not factor in square meters of available pool habitat, which would further exaggerate the relationships between the small and larger systems. The standout here is for coho production in relation to linear distances were Cronin, Lost, Spruce Run, Buchanan, and Cole. See Cronin Creek, only 2.4% of the total miles of the inventory, yet 6.6% of the total coho. Lost 1.8 to 6.9%. Spruce 1, 1.4 to 4.6. Buchanan 4.7 to 11.1. And Cole 4 to 8.4. We're going to take a closer look at the two systems in this table that I've highlighted. Cook Creek from the Lower Nehalem and Buchanan Creek from the North Fork. Here are the Buchanan subbasin numbers. As you can see, Buchanan wasn't the top contributor. In fact, soapstone was the top coho producer of the Buchanan Creek subbasin and contained highest quality habitat in all the listed tributaries. Soapstone Creek habitat strengths. High coho abundance. The soapstone subbasin accounted for 20.4% of the North Fork subbasin coho total, while comprising only 8.2% of the inventoried linear stream miles. Low summer temperatures were documented throughout the inventory. Intact headwaters within state forests increases potential for upslope watershed protections to ensure continued high water quality. This should be a restoration priority. Low gradient, the gradient range was ideal for coho spawning and rearing. Coniferous riparian, increased potential for future natural recruitment of coniferous wood complexity to help rebuild bedload and encourage lateral channel migration across the floodplains. Beaver occupation, as we know, beaver and coho are great partners with a mutually beneficial relationship that increases the health and productivity of aquatic habitats. And anchor sites, 10 anchor sites were documented in the soapstone subbasin, though lack of significant wood complexity was a limiting function. Here's a characteristic shot of soapstone, dominant substrates of bedrock, cobble, and gravel, with some extended reaches of scoured bedrock. Wood deficiency, definitely an issue. Nice to see some natural conifer recruitment here into the active channel though. Anchor site 1 at the confluence of Trib A. This is a beautiful off-channel habitat with broad low terrace and pools that had good coho numbers. Here's a distribution from the confluence of Buchanan to the end of coho distribution. Despite soapstone being a top coho producer, juvenile rearing densities were well below the system's potential capacity. Based on our spawning gravel figures, estimated adult escapement was already nearing the upper threshold of estimated adult carrying capacity. This may have been because spawning gravel functioned as a limiting factor in coho production for the 2018 brood year, which saw very low adult returns to the basin. That indicates that in years of higher adult escapement, the lack of spawning gravel availability would function as the definitive limiting factor for coho production in soapstone and its tributaries. Soapstone Trib B. This is an example of bedrock scour that was common in the basin. There's very little substrate left here other than scoured bedrock. There will be no fish spawning here. Now, Jack Horner Creek, which exhibited a similar proximity to nearing a gravel limitation, but has undergone extensive large wood debris treatment and is underway to recovery as the structures are maturing with increased bedload retention and gravel sorting. Some very complex habitat is building there. Here's some deep bedload impoundment above a log structure on Jack Horner, just packed with debris, just a beautiful flat of gravel and fines. Now let's take a look at Cook Creek. Cook Creek subbasin, 15.8 miles of stream habitat exhibiting anadromous potential. A considerable majority of coho Chinook, and steelhead production was observed rearing in the mainstem, while most of the cutthroat were documented in the tributaries. Several of the inventory tributaries, Dry, Forks, Granite, Harless, McKinney, South Fork, and Tribay, exhibited limited spawning and rearing potential due to high gradient, lack of spawning gravel, shallow pools, and or anadromous barriers. Though coho production was not extremely high in Cook Creek's value comes from a combination of several factors. Cook Creek habitat strength, salmonid abundance. Diversity of salmonid abundance with significant contributions to the coho, steelhead, cutthroat, and Chinook populations. Intact headwaters within state forests. Again, the opportunity for headwater preservation to ensure continued high volume cold water flows that benefit salmonids. This should be a high restoration priority considering the importance of Cook Creek's contribution to the Halem system. High volume cold water contribution to the mainstem. 7.8 degree Celsius differential from the mainstem to Halem, 15 degrees Celsius to 22.8 degrees Celsius. The mainstem there got actually higher as the course of the summer went on. Low down in the basin at river mile 13.3. This is the first significant thermal refugia that fish encounter moving upstream from the estuary. 11 anchor sites were documented in the Cook Creek subbasin, most exhibiting deficiencies in large wood complexity and spawning gravel. Like most of the inventory subbasins in the Lower Nehalem, Cook was limited by inadequate coho escapement with abundant gravel accumulations throughout. Some distribution here from the confluence with the Nehalen to the end of the inventory. Cook Creek mainstem extended 8.4 miles. Note the increased gravel abundance, coho density spikes, and increased steelhead abundance within the anchor site reaches. I tried to line these two up so the distances matched. Defined peaks in abundance. Lower Cook Creek, a long boulder riffle. This was a common habitat type through much of the mainstem Cook. A lack of complexity was observed throughout most of the mainstem. In particular, the lack of cover in the lower quarter mile of Cook Creek limited the rearing potential for temperature-dependent migrations out of the mainstem to Halem. And though abundance of pool habitat and abundance of cold water, there were very few salmonids observed in this reach. Some dynamic side channel habitat. This is side channel A, the only significant side channel within Cook Creek, and exhibited high wood complexity, low gradient, low flows, disconnected at both upstream and downstream ends. So it was not available to upstream migration out of Cook Creek. With sinuous channel, broad low terrace. It was observed rearing juvenile, Chinook, and cutthroat. To finish off Cook Creek, here's a log jam on Hansen Creek, a tributary to Cook, just to give you a shot of some of that legacy old wood. Where it's hanging out is mostly in these log jams or blown to the margins, decaying remnants. Let's move on to the restoration targets, where to focus. Develop a prioritized restoration plan. Our report is designed to be a guide to help determine stream restoration sites and prioritize actions. We have meticulously outlined the current salmonid production and limiting factors for every stream within the anadromous range of distribution here. Focus on conserving remnant function first. Focus restoration in areas already exhibiting healthy and productive salmonid use. These are the anchor sites. Protect, enhance existing cold water sources and thermal refugia. Side channel and floodplain enhancement, riparian planting, upslope land management to preserve the headwaters, increasing complexity at existing thermal refugia, and address man-made barriers to passage. Top priorities for restoration. This is a condensed version of a table in the report. These sites were chosen based on inherent potential, current function level, and salmonid abundance and diversity. The North Fork contained most of the high priority sites. As discussed earlier, the North Fork geology of siltstones and sandstones is largely responsible for its anchor site abundance. These lower gradient streams with more secondary channels and wider floodplains increases the occurrence of anchor sites along with increasing its potential for coho production. As discussed earlier, the Lower Nehalem is underlain primarily, with the exception of Foley Creek, by Tillamook volcanics. This results in higher gradient streams with larger substrates and fewer pools. Though, as we saw, an abundance of high quality habitat was also found throughout the Lower Nehalem tributaries. Let's finish off with some examples of high quality habitat targets. One of the few anchor sites in the Salmonberry subbasin, South Fork Salmonberry. Here's a chaotic and dynamic stream reach with wide active channel and high natural complexity. There's a lot going on here, but it's still lacking in large conifers. This is the level of large wood complexity we're after. This is Lost Creek, large woody debris treatment. Here's the upper North Fork, another large woody debris treatment. Here's a little North Fork Nehalem, beautiful jam, some large conifers. Upper Foley Creek, large woody debris treatment, deep gravel accumulations, low gradient, high complexity habitat up here. Some of these treatment logs are even acting as nursing logs, nurse logs. That about wraps it up. This is Wolf Creek Falls here, end of anadromy. This was a beautiful tributary to the Salmonberry. Here's a shot from up on the divide, the Cook-Miami Divide. We had the pleasure of camping up here during our inventories, and just a glorious, glorious place to be. Here's a sunset over the Neoconnies with the Nehalen Bay out in the distance. I'd like to give thanks to our surveyors who fought through clear cuts, blackberry thickets, and beaver swamps to bring us the data. It's Jim Holly, Andrew Chione, Nissa Rude, Mike Lees, Eric Thompson, and thanks to our senior fish biologist, Steve Trask.
Thank you so much.
All right. I kept it under an hour.
Huh?
I kept it under an hour.
You did a great job of it too. Yeah. And there's so much great material in there. And currently, we've already started applying some of this prioritization to choosing projects and pursuing projects in the basin. So it's been pretty exciting, and it helps us to be able to also really work some of the levers of funding to be able to do projects in some of these areas. So it's been a huge boon. And we actually already, one of the properties we did was a rural residential set of properties up on West Fork Coal Creek, which is actually that West Fork anchor that you highlighted. So that's pretty great. We have a couple questions in the chat for you. The first question says, I am stunned by the irony of the blockage of the stream by the fish hatchery. Isn't this working at cross purposes?
Yeah, I would say so.
And I followed up in the chat there by just mentioning that I've already have started conversations with ODFW about it, because that's a high priority for finding a solution to.
Yeah, I imagine it would be an expensive solution, and they're probably grandfathered in there.
Yep. Exactly. So it's going to be one to find a good creative way to solve.
Mhm.
The next question here in chat is, what/who are the prime predators of salmonids?
Other salmonids, mergansers, cormorants, otters, heron. What else in there? Other diving, hunting birds. Yeah, can you think of any others?
I mean, you've covered quite a few. I was just thinking about how
Humans
humans, yep, human activity will kill.
can really do a doozy.
Oh yeah. I mean, other salmonids and the birds are kind of the two biggest ones in my mind. I know that beaver will occasionally eat adults that are spawned out and have died on the side of the creek.
Oh, interesting.
They'll scavenge a little bit, which is a weird behavior, but you know. The next question is it a bad thing when large numbers of fish congregate in certain refugia? Does this suggest the lack of alternative places to congregate? Or does it not matter that multiple juveniles hide out in the same area? Does it affect their chance of survival that so many must congregate together, or is it good protection?
No. The opposite there, yeah. Yeah, very bad for them, really. You know, increases predation, increases transmission of disease, increases stress, competition for food. It's bad for them on all aspects, really. They're there because they have to be there because they have no place else to be, or they'll die. They're choosing that option over increased mortality rates out in the mainstem.
Great. I mean, that's not great, but a good answer. What metrics were used to determine the upper end of anadromous salmonid habitat?
The end of anadromous distribution. That was through the surveyor's discretion. Barriers to passage, availability of spawning and rearing habitat. Probably those three. Gradient, barriers to passage, availability of spawning and rearing habitat.
This next one here is a combination comment and question. So I'm just going to dive into it here. This is truly an amazing survey, very thorough with excellent data. Some translation of the meaning of this data for a public audience would enhance appreciation of the project. What does this data mean for the layman? Personally, I don't know enough to understand whether a large congregation of juveniles are a good thing or a problem. Thankfully, we answered that question. Overall, can you use the findings to transform the situation of these streams and improve their chances of not only surviving, but thriving? Many ordinary people will highly appreciate your study if you can better translate its meaning for a lay audience. Thanks so much.
I tried. I did try.
And I can jump on a bit of that as well. The Lower Nehalem Watershed Council, one of our primary activities is taking this information and transforming it into wood placement projects. And so one of the goals of talks like this, and why we try and target the North Coast with our advertising for it, is that we're trying to reach people and let them know that we're out here looking to do these large wood projects and these fish passage projects. And so if you are on a stream, if you have friends who live on a stream or a creek or a river, or either in the Lower Nehalem's coverage area or in some other watershed, contact your local watershed council. And if you're in my area, please contact me. Because we are looking to do these projects. We're looking to put more wood into streams. We're looking to do more riparian plantings. I want to replace more culverts. And I tend to have a lot of work on my plate, but I'm always excited to add more. And eventually that'll mean it can be me and somebody else, getting that stuff all done. So yeah, I'm going to put my email address in the chat for folks, but you can always also find our website. Just Google Lower Nehalem Watershed Council. The next question is, how in the world do you count moving fish?
It's tricky. Takes a lot of calm and purposeful movement. You have to enter the pool just right. You have to move in the right direction, and you have to corral the fish in the right direction. Like shepherding the fish along, shepherding them past you so you can quantify them and try not to spook them too much. Try not to get them to leave the pool or start swirling around. We do our best.
And you also have corrective factors based off of experience and using different kinds of surveys to determine what proportion you're likely to be missing and stuff, correct?
Yeah. There's a visual bias that's added to the coho numbers, and that's assuming that we're missing 20% of the coho in the pool, which I think is an overestimation actually in most pools, other than the very complex pool habitats. Visibility is really the key. The systems that have heavy tannins or reduced visibility, that really shuts our inventory down. But
hey, Jeremy, thanks so much. I had a question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, first, just again, thank you to you and Bio-Surveys for conducting this survey. It's really going to provide us at the Watershed Council a ton of valuable information in our restoration planning. So thank you again. Just a couple things. I'm curious, this is off of my working memory, but I seem to remember, and I'm sorry I don't have the actual hydrograph flows to back this up, but that those 2 years in 2018, 2019 seem to be fairly low flow summer years. And I'm just curious, generally speaking, when you're out surveying, do you actually want there to be lower flows, or how that might actually play into the overall distribution of coho, depending upon what that summertime low flow levels are?
Yeah, the low flows are critical for concentrating the fish in the pool and knowing the pool habitats and yeah, those low flow periods are when we want to conduct the inventory. So the lower the flow of the summer, then the better for surveying. Maybe not so good for the fish.
Hey, Zach.
Yeah, Troy.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, did I hear correctly that soapstone is funded for the summer?
Not soapstone. We have the Grand Rapids project where we're doing
Right. Yeah, I heard all that at the beginning, but I thought I heard a couple weeks ago that soapstone and the others that were packaged together were funded.
No, I haven't gotten. I'm actually taking Sarah from the Department of Forestry out to Soapstone next week, and we're going to be walking it and trying to encourage ODF to do a much more significant placement than that stretch of, I think it's Trib B, right, that they're currently planning on doing associated with the thinning up there.
Okay.
Yep. So if you go out for a walk with her too, be sure to lean on her for that as well.
Well, if you want company, and I'm available, or any of the others that can sway.
Yeah. I'll ship you that invitation so you know when we're going out. Be happy to have you along.
Yeah.
We're gonna try and
also-
do Soapstone, Sweet Home, and East Foley that
Okay.
day.
Great. And I also like to add that, you know, high concentrations of fish aren't bad if you have buku or habitat out there and they're all loaded to the gills with fish. I mean, I think that's what we're all shooting for. So it's only a bad thing in my mind when habitat's so limiting and everything in the basin's in one pool. So
Yeah, we'd rather
kind
the
of like to
habitat-
put that in perspective.
Yeah, ideally the habitat wouldn't be, the densities wouldn't be so high because the pools have shrunk so low because of low flows. They'd be high because of, high abundance and full seeding
Right.
habitat.
Exactly. Thanks. But yeah, great presentation, Jeremy. Appreciate the work
Thanks,
you
Troy.
did. Yeah.
Jeremy, I had another question, but I don't want to take it away from anyone else. So I wanted to make sure no one else had questions before I asked.
I think you're in the clear, Mark. Go for it.
Okay, so one thing that this presentation made me think about are these areas where we do see a lot of scour to bedrock, and those could be areas where we'd want to do some large wood placements. But another thing that got me thinking is we're only going to trap gravel if there's some source of that gravel upstream, right? So we're either going to have to wait for some sort of debris flow in the future on a high flow winter event or what. So it just made me think, oh, well, maybe we need some sort of geologic survey to understand if there's any actual recruitment of gravel possible in these systems. So just curious your thoughts on that kind of scenario, or if that's something that you have any experience with.
I do think that most of those systems, there's still a fair amount of gravel moving through those systems, even though we're not seeing it because it's all getting washed downstream. But I do think, especially in the North Fork Nehalem, I do believe there's a lot of gravel coming out of those tributaries, little tributaries, and so even though we're not seeing it, I still think there's probably pretty rich gravel resources there.
I have two things to add to that, actually, based off of we've been doing that process to develop the Nehalem Strategic Action Plan for Coho, which this all data went into. And another piece of that has been modeling potential debris flow locations that would deliver sizable wood as well as additional gravel. And so that's one piece of that puzzle. Is we have done some modeling to identify where some of that might come in. The other piece to think about with it is that a lot of those big gravel bars on some of our swimming holes, like at Cook Creek or Lost Creek, a lot of those gravel bars get scoured out in the winter, and then it gets redeposited by the time we have summer. And so, I mean, not all that gravel is cycling, but some of it definitely is. And so that's another piece of that puzzle where there's definitely a lot of gravel around because we keep replenishing those bars.
Mm-hmm. A lot of movement.
Yeah. We just got to trap it.
Just got to keep it together.
Any other questions?
I do have one more, if no one else does. Well, maybe a comment too, but it was interesting to not see any fish at the confluence there with Foley Creek. Foley Creek is such a highly productive spawning habitat creek, so it gets a ton of chum. It gets Chinook, coho, steelhead, it gets everything. So it's really interesting to not see any fish there at that confluence. But I guess I'll have to go in and look in the data more to see how much was seen in the pools in Foley Creek itself. But I wonder just your thoughts on that, or any anecdotal evidence of why they're not there.
Yeah, it did have some fish there. It had 15 cuts and 75 Chinook. Yeah, but no coho, 0 or steelhead were there. But I think it's a lack of cover at that spot. It's a real big exposed pool. Maybe it had something to do with the tide there too, where the fish are moving, kind of moving back and up. So they're not rearing as much right there in that main stem pool, but they're rearing a little higher up there. And when the tide drains out, they're actually in pools of Foley Creek. But I was surprised by that as well. The lack of fish in most of those lower tidal seeps and tributaries.
Yeah, on some flows you do get tide moving up, actually up Foley Creek, about to where the bridge is, maybe about a half mile up. So yeah, I was wondering if that actually played a role at all. But in summertime, I don't think we're seeing those high tides all the way up there.
Yeah, we just sampled the pool below there. I think it was low tide when we sampled it there. So maybe had we actually surveyed there at high tide, and depending on what it was during the summer, we would have gone a little bit further up there. But it's possible that those fish were actually included in the Foley Creek inventory in the first couple pools of the Foley Creek inventory. I know there were large, high abundances of cutthroat in those first couple pools of the Foley Creek main stem inventory.
Great, thanks so much, appreciate it.
Well, great. If we don't have any other questions, I want to thank you again, Jeremy, for being here for this presentation and sharing all this information with us. I also want to thank Steve Trask, who's in the audience here and did a lot of work on this. And I hope everyone has a great evening. If you have follow-up questions, I put my email address in the chat, and you can also always find us at Lower Nehalem Watershed Council. Just Google us and we'll pop up, and you can go to our website, find my contact information, get a hold of me, tell me you think fish are great,
And don't hesitate to take a look at that report. If you want to get deeper, check it out. A lot of information in there.
The report will be on the website. It's not yet because we're about to undergo a website redesign. And so after that, it'll be available. If you want to take a look at it before then, feel free to email me and I'm happy to share it.
Excellent. Thank you all very much.
Great. Have a nice evening, everyone.